One morning, John Carter found his lawn turned into a parking lot by his neighbor's car. When he turned to HOA chairperson Karen Hunt for help, she dismissed him with a smug smile, confident in her authority. But Karen didn't know John was quietly gathering evidence to expose the truth. They underestimated the wrong man. Let's start from the beginning. It was an early Saturday morning when the first rays of sunlight peeked through the windows of John Carter's home. The soft hum of birdsong filled the air as John, a veteran and a proud father of two, stood on his porch, coffee in hand, admiring the view of his carefully maintained lawn. This small patch of green was more than just grass. It was a testament to years of hard work, a sanctuary of peace in a neighborhood bustling with life. But something was off. Right there, in the middle of his lush, manicured lawn, stood a car. Not his car, not a visitor's. A black sedan with dusty windows and a dented bumper, a sight that instantly jarred the serenity of his morning. For a moment, John just stared, confusion flickering across his face. He rubbed his eyes, half expecting the car to vanish, as if it were some early morning mirage. But no, it was real, and it was parked blatantly on his lawn. Well, this has to be a mistake, John muttered under his breath. Setting his coffee cup down, he marched over to the car, examining it for a note or some clue as to why it was there. Nothing. Deciding to address the matter directly, he walked over to his neighbor Mark's house. Mark, notorious for his brash attitude and disregard for others, lived 2 houses down. John had always maintained a polite but distant relationship with him, sensing that Mark thrived on confrontation. Still, he believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Knocking firmly on Mark's door, John waited. Moments later, the door creaked open to reveal Mark in a rumpled t-shirt and basketball shorts, his expression a mix of annoyance and impatience. "Yeah?" Mark grunted, leaning against the doorframe. "Good morning, Mark," John began, keeping his tone neutral. "I noticed a car parked on my lawn this morning. Is it yours by any chance?" Mark's eyes flicked to the side before he crossed his arms, his demeanor hardening. "Yeah, that's mine. What about it?" John blinked, taken aback by the bluntness. "Well, it's on my property, and I'd appreciate it if you could move it. You see, it's damaging the grass," and before John could finish, Mark cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Look, Carter, the street's packed, okay? There's no room to park anywhere else. You got plenty of space on that lawn of yours. What's the big deal?" For a moment, John was at a loss for words. "Mark, it's not about space. It's about respecting boundaries. That's my property." Mark snorted, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Boundaries? You're really going to make a fuss over this? Some of us have real problems, you know. Just let it go." And with that, Mark stepped back inside and shut the door in John's face. John stood there for a moment, the weight of Mark's dismissal sinking in. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but so did disbelief. How could someone be so cavalier about something so basic? Respect for another person's property. Walking back to his porch, John glanced at his lawn again, now scarred with tire tracks. He clenched his jaw, a determined glint in his eyes. This isn't just about the lawn, he thought. This is about standing up for what's right. And just like that, the quiet harmony of his suburban life began to unravel. The next morning, John stepped outside, hoping for a fresh start, only to be greeted by an unpleasant sight that made his heart sink. The once pristine lawn he had so carefully tended now resembled a construction site. Deep tire tracks crisscrossed the grass, leaving behind patches of churned-up dirt and broken blades. His chest tightened as he surveyed the damage. This wasn't just a careless mistake. It felt deliberate, like an act of defiance etched into the earth itself. John knelt down, running his fingers over the torn grass, as if trying to assess the extent of the injury to his cherished property. It wasn't just a lawn. It was a part of his home, a place where his kids played, where family barbecues brought laughter, and where he found peace. And now, it was a battlefield. Frustration bubbling, John decided it was time to escalate the matter to the Homeowners Association, HOA. If anyone had the authority to mediate and ensure community standards were upheld, it was them. Or so he thought. Arriving at the HOA office, John was met by Karen Hunt, the association's chairperson, a woman whose reputation for micromanaging and dismissing complaints preceded her. Karen sat behind her desk, her expression one of thinly veiled impatience, as John explained the situation. "Karen, this isn't just a small issue," John pleaded, his voice steady but firm. "Mark's car has destroyed part of my property. I need the HOA to step in and address this." Karen leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a dismissive smile. "John, let's be reasonable. It's just a little grass, isn't it? Surely we can let this slide. After all, we're neighbors. Harmony is key in a community like ours." John felt his patience wearing thin. It's not just about the grass. It's about respect and boundaries. If this goes unchecked, what's next? Parking in someone's driveway? Building on someone else's property? Karen waved her hand, brushing off his concerns as though they were nothing more than trivial complaints. "You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. I'm sure you two can work it out on your own. Let's not waste resources on something so minor." John left the meeting feeling more disheartened than ever. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to help, and any hope of resolving this peacefully had just been dashed. As he walked back home, a sense of determination began to take root. If no one else would stand up for what was right, he would. That evening, John began installing cameras around his property. He carefully positioned them to capture any future incidents, knowing that he would need solid evidence to confront Mark or anyone else who decided to test his resolve. The cameras became his silent witnesses, a shield against the growing tide of disrespect. But Mark was quick to notice the new additions. The next day, John found trash, fast food wrappers, empty cans, and other debris scattered across his lawn. It was a clear message. Mark wasn't backing down. Later that evening, as John was tidying up the mess, Mark appeared at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed and a smirk plastered across his face. "What's with the cameras, Carter? You trying to play detective now?" John straightened, meeting Mark's gaze with calm resolve. "They're there to protect my property, Mark. If you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't worry about them." Mark took a step closer, his tone turning sharp. "You think you're so clever, huh? Let me tell you something. You're wasting your time. No one cares about your precious grass." For a moment, the air between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. But John held his ground, refusing to let Mark's intimidation get the better of him. Without another word, Mark turned and walked away. But John knew this was far from over. As the sun set that evening, John sat on his porch, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He felt the weight of the day's events pressing down on him, but he also felt a spark of resolve burning brighter than ever. This wasn't just about his lawn. It was about standing up for himself and for what was right. And no matter how messy things got, he wasn't going to back down. John sat at his dining table, the morning sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating a stack of papers, his laptop, and a steaming cup of coffee. His frustration with Mark and the lack of support from the HOA had reached its peak. It was time to take decisive action. After hours of research and consultations, John had finally found his answer. He had the legal right to call for Mark's car to be towed if it was parked on his property without permission. The relief he felt was immense, as though a weight had been lifted. Over the next few days, John got to work. Armed with his camera footage, he meticulously documented every instance of Mark's car invading his lawn. The tire tracks, the repeated damage, and even Mark's confrontational attitude. All of it was carefully logged and stored. John felt a renewed sense of purpose. Each piece of evidence was a step closer to reclaiming his peace of mind and sending a clear message. Enough was enough. But Karen Hunt, the chairperson of the HOA, wasn't about to make things easy. News of John's preparations had apparently reached her ears, and she made a point of addressing the matter during a neighborhood meeting. Standing before the small crowd of residents in her meticulously pressed blazer, Karen delivered a thinly veiled critique. "As the HOA, we are here to protect the rights and harmony of all our residents," she declared, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's important to remember that small disagreements between neighbors should not be escalated unnecessarily. We are a community after all." John clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists beneath the table. It was clear she was trying to undermine him, to paint his efforts as petty and disruptive. But as he looked around the room, he noticed a few neighbors exchanging glances, their expressions tinged with doubt. It was obvious that Karen's stance wasn't winning everyone over. Then came the morning that changed everything. John woke up to the now familiar sight of Mark's black sedan parked squarely on his lawn, as if mocking him. But today was different. John calmly picked up his phone, dialed the number of the local towing service, and provided them with the necessary information. Within half an hour, the tow truck arrived, its rumbling engine announcing its presence. John stood on his porch, his arms crossed, watching as the truck backed onto his driveway and positioned itself to haul away Mark's car. It was a moment of quiet triumph, the culmination of days of preparation. Mark, however, was less than pleased. The sound of the tow truck must have drawn him out of his house, because soon enough, he came storming out, his face a deep shade of red. "What do you think you're doing?" Mark bellowed, pointing an accusatory finger at John. "You can't do this. You don't have the right." John stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Actually, I do. Your car has been parked on my property without permission for weeks. I've documented everything and consulted with an attorney. This is completely within my rights." Mark's anger boiled over as he gestured wildly at the tow truck driver, who continued his work without so much as a glance in Mark's direction. "This is ridiculous. You're making a scene over nothing." John didn't flinch. "This isn't nothing, Mark. This is about respecting boundaries. You've had plenty of chances to stop this, but you chose not to." As the tow truck drove away with Mark's car, the tension hung thick in the air. Mark stomped back to his house, slamming the door behind him, but not before throwing one last glare in John's direction. John exhaled deeply, the adrenaline coursing through him beginning to fade. Standing on his now empty lawn, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had taken control of the situation. The battle wasn't over, but this was a victory, and it was one he wouldn't soon forget. The air in the neighborhood seemed heavier, charged with whispers and tension. After Mark's car had been towed, Karen Hunt, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, wasted no time stirring up trouble. She called an emergency meeting where she positioned herself as the defender of the community, painting John as a rogue resident who cared little for harmony. "This kind of behavior undermines the trust and unity we strive for," Karen declared, her tone righteous. She swept her gaze across the room, ensuring every neighbor felt the weight of her words. "John Carter's actions don't reflect the values of our community. We need to hold him accountable." John, standing at the back of the room, clenched his fists. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but he knew this wasn't the time. Karen had been at this for years, using her influence to twist narratives and suppress dissent. This wasn't her first campaign of whispers, but John was determined to make it her last. Karen's efforts didn't stop at the meeting. She began circulating rumors, suggesting that John was a troublemaker who prioritized his pride over the neighborhood's well-being. Some neighbors, initially unsure of what to believe, started to question John's motives. But John was ready. Over the past weeks, he had carefully compiled evidence, not just of Mark's repeated infractions, but of Karen's dismissive attitude and blatant favoritism. He had video footage of Mark's threats, audio recordings of confrontations, and clear documentation of Karen's refusal to mediate. Armed with these, John decided it was time to act. The next morning, he visited the local police department, presenting his evidence to an officer who listened intently. The video of Mark threatening John while standing on his lawn left no room for doubt. The officer assured John that this behavior was unacceptable and warranted further investigation. For the first time, John felt like the scales were tipping in his favor. Back in the neighborhood, the rumors Karen had sown began to unravel. John's evidence didn't just remain with the police, it started to circulate among the neighbors. Videos of Mark's blatant disrespect and Karen's dismissive remarks were shared in hushed conversations, quickly gaining traction. "I knew there was more to this," one neighbor exclaimed during an informal gathering. "Karen's been sweeping things under the rug for too long." "I've had my own issues with her," another chimed in. "She only helps if you're in her inner circle." The more people learned about John's ordeal, the more they sympathized with him. What had initially seemed like a personal feud now revealed a larger issue: the unchecked power Karen wielded over the HOA, and her tendency to favor certain residents at the expense of others. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began reaching out to John, offering support and sharing their own grievances. The tide was turning, and Karen could feel her grip slipping. For the first time, she found herself on the defensive as whispers of dissatisfaction grew louder and more unified. John, though relieved, remained focused. He knew this was just the beginning. Karen's attempts to silence him had backfired, and the community was starting to see the truth. The cracks in her facade were widening, and John was determined to make sure they wouldn't be repaired. For now, he allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. As he stood on his porch that evening, watching his children play in the yard, he felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he wasn't standing alone. The community was waking up, and together, they were stronger than Karen ever anticipated. Weeks passed, and the tension that had gripped the neighborhood began to shift. John Carter, steadfast and methodical, filed an official complaint against Karen Hunt and the HOA. The claims were clear: negligence in addressing community concerns and defamation aimed at undermining his reputation. The evidence John presented was indisputable: recordings of Karen's dismissive comments, documentation of her inaction, and undeniable proof of Mark's repeated trespasses on John's property. The day of the hearing was crisp and bright, the kind of day that felt like a clean slate. John arrived at the courthouse, carrying a folder thick with evidence. He was calm, his resolve as firm as the morning sun overhead. Inside, the atmosphere was charged. Karen sat with a stiff posture, her usual air of authority replaced by a nervous tension. Mark, looking far less defiant than usual, avoided John's gaze entirely. John presented his case with precision. The footage of Mark's threats and repeated parking violations painted a vivid picture of harassment. But the turning point came when John played an audio clip of Karen brushing off his concerns during an HOA meeting. Her words, dismissive and laced with condescension, echoed in the silent courtroom. "This is just petty drama. Let's not waste time on it." The judge's decision was swift and clear. Karen was found to have violated her duties as HOA chairperson, neglecting the needs of the community she was meant to serve. Mark, too, was held accountable for repeatedly trespassing on John's property, with the added penalty of covering the impound fees for his car, which remained locked away until every fine was paid. Karen's resignation came quickly after the ruling. For years, she had operated with an air of invincibility, but now her authority had crumbled. The neighborhood convened to elect a new HOA board, one focused on fairness and transparency. For the first time in years, the community felt hopeful about its future. Back at home, John stood on his freshly repaired lawn, watching his children chase each other in the afternoon sun. The tire tracks were gone, replaced by a vibrant stretch of green, a symbol of both recovery and resilience. Neighbors began stopping by to thank him, sharing their own stories of frustrations they'd kept to themselves for too long. At the next HOA meeting, John addressed the group, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "It's important to stand up for what's right," he said, looking out at the faces of his neighbors. "This isn't just about property lines or rules. It's about respect. Injustice can only grow when we stay silent. We have the power to protect what's ours, but it starts with speaking up." Applause erupted in the room, a genuine and heartfelt acknowledgement of the struggle John had endured. His fight had inspired others, showing them that even against overwhelming odds, change was possible when driven by determination and truth. As John returned home that evening, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, he had regained not only his lawn, but also his sense of security and pride. For the first time in months, he could sit on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, knowing he had done what was right, not just for himself, but for his entire community.